The small music hall in the Sterling mansion that evening wasn't meant for any formal concert. It was just a rowdy gathering of rich kids showing off. Adrian Sterling, 18 years old, the only son of billionaire financier, Edward Sterling leaned against the grand piano holding a yellowed Mozart sheet in his hand. "Sing this Mozart piece," he said with a smirk, "and I'll marry you." The room erupted in laughter. Everyone knew it was just a joke, an arrogant dare. The one pulled into this game was Mira Hayes, 16, the maid's daughter. She'd only come to bring table linens that were already perfectly flat, but suddenly became entertainment for the entire room. Mira stood near the door, still holding her fabric basket. Someone urged, "Come on, sing! Or can maids only scrub floors?" No one knew that in the cold, damp basement behind the kitchen, this girl had sung Mozart to herself hundreds of times in darkness no one cared about. And in just a few minutes, Adrian would be the one unable to lift his head before that voice. But before we continue, comment where you're watching this video from. We'd love to know how far our story has traveled, and make sure you've subscribed to the channel. Now let's get into the story. The Sterling mansion existed in two worlds separated by marble staircases and invisible lines no one dared to cross. Upstairs, crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light and scattered it like diamonds across walls lined with paintings, worth more than most people's homes. The music room alone could have been a concert hall, its Steinway grand piano positioned beneath a skylight that framed it like a work of art. The living room stretched wide as a hotel lobby, every surface polished to reflection. Downstairs, narrow hallways twisted past small staff quarters where the smell of cleaning solution mixed with whatever was cooking in the industrial kitchen. The ceilings hung lower here. The lights buzzed. This was where the real work of keeping the mansion beautiful happened, out of sight, out of mind. Edward Sterling, 55, ran his investment empire, the way he ran his household, with absolute control and minimal warmth. He rarely smiled. To him, everything was a project. Everything had measurable returns. Even his son. Adrian Sterling had just turned 18. He was striking in that careless way wealthy boys often are, blessed with good looks he'd never had to work for, and talent he'd stopped appreciating years ago. He'd won small piano competitions as a child, collected trophies his father displayed like quarterly earnings reports. But somewhere along the way, music had become less about passion and more about performance, about impressing guests at parties, about being another achievement on the Sterling family resume. Evelyn Hayes had worked for the Sterlings for 12 years. She was quiet, endlessly patient, always afraid of being too much trouble. She'd learned to make herself small, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to exist in the background of other people's grand lives. Her daughter Mira was 16, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed too bright for someone who spent so much time in dim hallways. She spoke little, observed much. While other teenagers were building social media followings, Mira was teaching herself music from discarded CD cases, YouTube clips on a cracked phone screen, and sheet music she'd salvaged from the recycling bin outside the music room. No one knew she could sing. No one except the four walls of the basement storage room. Every night after helping her mother finish the day's work, Mira would slip down to the storage area. She'd turn her phone volume low and play recordings of opera singers, their voices crackling through the cheap speaker. At first, she'd only mouth the words. Then she began to hum. Then gradually she sang fully, clearly, every note precise, every word intentional. For her, music was refuge. "When I sing," she'd whisper to herself in that cold space, "I'm not the maid's daughter anymore. I'm just a voice." Adrian had once loved music the way Mira did now. There had been one person who taught him to hear its soul, his mother Lillian Sterling, who died when he was 12. Before the cancer, she would sit beside him during practice, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She never corrected his technique harshly. Instead, she'd say things like, "Feel that measure, sweetheart. That's not just notes. That's someone's heartbreak written down so it wouldn't be forgotten." After she died, Adrian kept playing because his father insisted. But the heart went out of it. Music became mechanical, something he did with his fingers while his mind wandered elsewhere. Eventually, it became a party trick, something to show off to friends before moving on to the next distraction. One afternoon, Mira was folding table linens in the music room when she heard Adrian attempting Mozart. She froze behind the door, not daring to enter, but unable to walk away. She listened to every note. What she heard troubled her. He's playing it correctly, she thought, but there's no sadness in it, no ache, just fingers moving across keys, no heart. When Adrian left, Mira walked slowly to the piano. She stood there for a moment, then whispered to the empty room, "If it were me, I'd sing that passage slower. Let it hurt more." She had no idea that one day soon, she'd have to sing it in front of the very person she'd just silently critiqued, and that when she did, everything would change. The weekend Edward Sterling left for Singapore, the mansion transformed into Adrian's personal playground. His friends arrived in luxury cars that purred up the circular driveway like sleek animals. They were the sons and daughters of tech moguls, real estate developers, old money families who measured wealth in generations. They wore clothes that cost more than Evelyn's monthly salary and treated the Sterling estate like it existed for their amusement. Evelyn and Mira had been given their instructions: prepare light refreshments, keep the glassware spotless, stay out of sight once everything was set up. They worked efficiently, laying out imported cheeses and fruit arrangements that looked almost too perfect to eat. When they finished, they retreated toward the kitchen, trying to become invisible. But visibility, Mira was about to learn, wasn't always a choice. "Wait, who's that?" one of Adrian's friends called out as Mira crossed through the hallway carrying an empty tray. A girl in designer sunglasses pushed indoors laughed. "That's the help's kid. I've seen her skulking around the music room before." "Oh my God," another one chimed in. "Does she think she's like musical or something? That's adorable." The energy in the room shifted instantly, the way it does when bored teenagers spot new entertainment. "Bring her in here," someone suggested. "Let's give her a stage, or at least give ourselves a good laugh." Mira was summoned into the music room like a performer called for an audition she never requested. She stood clutching her basket shoulders, straight eyes fixed on a spot just above everyone's heads, not meeting anyone's gaze directly. They circled her with questions that weren't really questions, just verbal games. "How old are you?" 16. "Do you go to school?" "Yes, but I also help my mother." "That's sweet," one of them said with exaggerated sympathy that barely masked the mockery underneath. Adrian stood and stretched, grabbing the Mozart sheet music from the piano's music stand. He was enjoying this the way he'd learned to enjoy having an audience. He spread the yellowed paper across the piano's closed lid, tapping it with one finger before turning to Mira. "Hey everyone, I've got something fun." The room leaned in. "Sing this Mozart piece." Adrian said, his voice drawing out the words like he was making a grand pronouncement, pointing directly at Mira. "And I'll marry you." The room exploded. Laughter bounced off the high ceilings. "Oh my God, Adrian! That's perfect. Come on, future. Mrs. Sterling, step right up." Mira's face flushed deep red. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape back to the safety of the basement where no one watched, no one judged, no one turned her existence into comedy. But her feet stayed planted. One of Adrian's friends, a guy in an expensive hoodie, leaned back in his chair. "If you can't do it, just say so. No need to pretend." "Yeah," another one added. "Or can you only sing lullabies while mopping floors?" The cruelty was casual, thoughtless. They weren't even trying to be mean. This was just what happened when people had never been told no, never been made to consider that their entertainment might be someone else's humiliation. In that moment, Mira had two choices. She could curl inward the way she always had, accept her place in their hierarchy, turn and leave, with her dignity quietly intact, but her voice forever silenced. Or she could let the things she'd hidden in basements and sung to cold walls finally emerge into light. She lifted her chin. For the first time, she looked directly at Adrian. Really looked at him. "If I sing," she said quietly but clearly, "will you stop making jokes about things you don't understand?" The room went still. The sudden silence felt almost physical. Adrian blinked, surprised. For a second, something flickered across his face, something that might have been shame or curiosity or both. Then he shrugged, trying to recover his casual indifference. "Sure, whatever, just sing." He sat down at the piano, positioning his hands over the keys. He began the introduction, the notes precise and technically perfect. Exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd had the best teachers money could buy. Mira took a deep breath. Her hands still gripped the basket. She closed her eyes and then she sang. The first note emerged not like a shout or a plea, but like a door opening. Warm, clear, trembling, slightly at first before steadying into something undeniable. It wasn't the voice of someone trying to prove anything. It was the voice of someone who lived with this music in secret for so long that it had become part of her breathing. The kids who'd been smirking at the first note had gone quiet by the third phrase. One of them whispered, "Wait, she's actually," but didn't finish the sentence. Someone forgot they were recording on their phone, the device slowly lowering to their lap. And Adrian, still playing, felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd kept locked for 6 years. The first phrase of Mozart emerged from Mira's throat like something that had been waiting its entire life to be released. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy. It was warm and clear with a slight tremor on the opening note that quickly steadied like someone finding their footing on a stage they were always meant to stand on. The friends who'd been sneering at the beginning found their smirks fading by the third measure. One of them started to say something sarcastic, but the words died before reaching air. Another glanced around confused by his own reaction. "This isn't supposed to be," but he didn't finish. The girl with designer sunglasses had pushed them up onto her head. She was staring. Mira's voice didn't force its way into the room. It simply filled it the way light fills a space when curtains are finally drawn back. There was something instinctive in how she shaped each phrase, not from textbook training, but from something deeper. The poverty she'd witnessed the nights she'd heard her mother's exhausted sighs, the loneliness of singing to concrete walls, all of it flowed into the music without her even trying. She wasn't performing Mozart. She was living inside it. Adrian kept playing, but his hands had started to feel disconnected from his brain. The melody he'd played 1,000 times before suddenly sounded different. The harmonies he'd taken for granted now seemed to carry weight they'd never had. And then the memory hit him. He was 9 years old again, sitting beside his mother in a concert hall downtown. The lights had dimmed. His small hand rested in hers. The soprano on stage was singing this exact piece, and his mother had leaned close to whisper, "Listen carefully, sweetheart. Mozart isn't just notes on a page. It's the sound of someone who lost everything and loved everything and regretted everything all at once." He'd nodded, not fully understanding but feeling it somehow. The way children can sense truth before they have words for it. The audience had applauded. His mother had wiped her eyes. He remembered thinking adults crying at music was strange, but also beautiful. After she died, he'd locked that memory away. Locked away everything that connected him to those feelings, because feeling them meant remembering what he'd lost. Now in his own music room, a 16-year-old girl he'd tried to humiliate was forcing that door back open. Mira reached the climactic passage. Her eyes opened, not focusing on anyone in particular, but somehow seeing through everyone. Her voice rose not in volume, but in emotional intensity. It wasn't a shout. It was something breaking open from the deepest chamber of a heart that had learned to hide its treasures. Adrian's fingers stumbled. He missed a chord. For half a second, his hands froze over the keys before scrambling to catch up. But the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer leading this performance. He was chasing her, trying to keep pace with something he'd forgotten how to feel. The room had contracted to just light and sound. The expensive furniture, the imported rugs, the evidence of wealth, none of it mattered. There was only the girl singing and the boy playing, and the space between them that was rapidly filling with something neither could name. When Mira sang the final phrase, letting it fade like smoke dissolving into air, no one moved. No one clapped. The silence was thick, heavy, uncomfortable, in the way truth often is when it arrives uninvited. Mira opened her eyes fully. She took a breath, steadying herself. Then she lowered her gaze and said softly, "I'm finished. May I return to my work?" She turned and walked toward the door, her soft-soled shoes nearly silent on the hardwood. The basket still hung from her arm. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than it should have. For a long moment, no one spoke. Adrian sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his heart beating in an irregular rhythm he couldn't control. One of his friends finally broke the silence. "Adrian, are you okay?" He didn't answer immediately. How could he explain what had just happened? That a girl he'd tried to mock had just reminded him who he used to be. That for the first time in 6 years, he'd felt his mother's presence in music again. That he'd been so busy using his talent as a party trick that he'd forgotten it could actually mean something. "Everyone should go," he said quietly. "What I said, everyone should go. Tonight's over." They left in confusion, whispering to each other in the driveway, checking their phones to see if any of them had captured video. But none of them had. They'd all forgotten in those minutes that anything existed outside that room. Adrian sat alone at the piano after they'd gone. The sheet music still lay where he'd placed it, yellowed paper, with pencil marks his mother had made when she'd played the same piece years ago. He touched one of those pencil marks with his fingertip. Mira's final words echoed in his head. "Will you stop making jokes about things you don't understand?" He'd thought he understood everything about music. He'd had the best teachers, the finest instrument, years of training. But tonight, a girl who'd learned Mozart in a basement had shown him he'd been playing notes without hearing what they meant. His chest felt tight. His throat ached. He realized with surprise that he was close to crying, something he hadn't done since the funeral. That night, Adrian didn't sleep. He lay in his expensive bed in his expensive room and heard Mira's voice repeating the final phrase over and over. Not because it haunted him, but because it had woken something in him he'd thought was dead. By morning, he knew one thing with certainty: he needed to understand how someone with nothing had managed to create something he with everything had lost completely. The next morning, Evelyn Hayes was trembling as she approached the estate manager's office. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter last night, the noise she made, the disruption. I take full responsibility. It won't happen again." The estate manager, Mr. Chen, looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "The music room, the gathering. Mira shouldn't have—" "Mrs. Hayes," Mr. Chen held up a hand. "The young master specifically told me this morning, don't let anyone blame them." Those were his exact words. "I've worked here 15 years. I've never heard him say anything like that." Evelyn blinked, uncertain whether to feel relieved or more worried. Mira, meanwhile, had restructured her entire day to avoid Adrian. She worked in the far wings of the house, took routes through hallways she knew he never used, timed her tasks for when he'd be at school or out with friends. If she could just become invisible again, maybe everything would return to normal. But invisibility, she was learning, was no longer an option. The person who found her first wasn't Adrian at all. Harold Sterling, 80 years old and largely forgotten by his own family, lived in a separate wing of the estate. The grandfather everyone knew existed, but rarely thought about. He'd made his fortune in manufacturing decades ago, retired early, and now spent his days reading in his private study, a man content with memories and solitude. That evening, as Mira cleaned the hallway near his quarters, she hummed softly without thinking. Just a few bars of the Mozart piece, barely audible. "You know that one." A voice emerged from the dimly lit study. Mira jumped, nearly dropping her cleaning supplies. She turned to see Harold sitting in a leather chair by the window, a book resting in his lap. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disturb." "Disturb?" Harold's weathered face creased into a smile. "That's the most beautiful sound I've heard in this house in years. Come here, child." Mira hesitated, then stepped into the study, her hands clasped in front of her. "You're Evelyn's daughter." "Yes, sir." "The one who sang last night?" It wasn't a question. Mira nodded, heat rising to her cheeks. Harold gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit, please. Would you sing it again for an old man? The whole thing this time?" "Sir, I couldn't possibly." "When Adrian's mother was alive," Harold said softly, "she used to hum along when he practiced piano. She couldn't carry a tune properly, but she didn't care. She'd hum and sway, and it made the music mean something. After she died, this house became silent in ways that have nothing to do with noise." Hunini, Mira sat slowly, understanding this wasn't really a request. She sang, softer this time, gentler, as if singing for someone's memory rather than someone's judgment. Her voice filled the small study with warmth. Harold closed his eyes. A single tear traced down his weathered cheek. What Mira didn't know was that Adrian stood just outside the door. He'd been looking for his grandfather to ask him something trivial, and had frozen when he heard that voice again. He watched through the crack in the door as the old man listened, as tears fell unchecked, as something like peace settled over features usually tight with loneliness. When the final note faded, Harold opened his eyes. "Your voice sounds like the way his mother used to make music feel. Not perfect technique, but honest. Real. Thank you, child." After Mira left, Adrian remained in the hallway, his back against the wall. He'd seen his grandfather cry. Harold Sterling, who'd built an empire through sheer determination, who never showed weakness, had wept openly because a teenage girl had sung with her whole heart. The realization settled over Adrian like cold water. He'd forgotten how to do that. He'd learned to play music the way his father conducted business, precisely, impressively, but without soul. He'd turned his mother's gift into a performance, a transaction, something to display rather than feel. That night, Adrian did something he hadn't done in years. He knocked on the door of the staff quarters. Evelyn answered, her face immediately tightening with fear. "Young master, is something wrong?" "No, Mrs. Hayes, nothing's wrong. I was hoping I could speak with Mira, if that's okay." Evelyn glanced back uncertainly, then called her daughter. Mira appeared standing stiffly in the doorway, her hands behind her back. "Yes, I wanted to apologize," Adrian said, "for last night, for making you a joke, for—" He stopped, searching for words. "For not understanding what I was hearing until it was too late." Mira watched him carefully. "You don't need to apologize. You gave me permission to sing. Most people don't even do that." "That's not enough, though, is it?" Adrian ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. "Look, I know this is going to sound strange, but would you help me? Help you with what? Learn how to hear music again. Not just play it, actually hear it the way you do. The way my mother used to." His voice cracked slightly. "I've forgotten how. And watching you, listening to you, I realized I want to remember." Mira studied him for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw something she recognized, someone who'd lost something precious and didn't know how to find it again. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but not because you're the boss's son, because music deserves people who respect it." "Deal," Adrian said quietly. Neither of them knew it yet, but that conversation would change everything that followed. From that evening forward, something unusual began happening in the Sterling mansion. After Mira finished her duties and Adrian completed his schoolwork, they met in the music room under a simple agreement: no friends watching, no cameras recording, no performances. Just two people and the music they were trying to understand. Mira's way of teaching was unlike anything Adrian had experienced with his expensive tutors. When he played Mozart, she would suddenly say, "Stop." He'd lift his hands from the keys, confused. "What's wrong?" "You're playing it like a machine. That passage right there, do you know what was happening in Mozart's life when he wrote this?" Adrian would shrug. "Music is music. You play the notes correctly." "No." Mira shook her head firmly. "It's not just notes. It's somebody's words. If you can't hear what they're saying, you're just hitting keys." She told him about the first time she'd heard Mozart. It was in the kitchen through an old radio covered in grease stains. She'd been washing dishes and the sound had stopped her mid-motion. "I thought it was angel music," she said quietly. "I started imagining the person who wrote it. What made them sad? What made them hope? What they wished they could say out loud but could only say through music." Adrian stared at her. "You got all that from a radio in a kitchen." "I got it because I listened. Not just with my ears." She touched her chest. "With this," she continued, "I don't know complicated music theory, but I know what loneliness feels like. And this music," she gestured to the sheet, "it sounds like loneliness trying to find its way home." Gradually, something shifted in Adrian's playing. He started playing slower, not to show off technique, but to actually hear each chord as it resolved into the next. Instead of rushing through passages to prove his skill, he began to breathe with the music, letting silence matter as much as sound. One afternoon, Mira stopped him again. "That crescendo you're pushing too hard. It's not anger, it's heartbreak. There's a difference." "Show me," Adrian said. She sang the phrase, her voice swelling, not with force but with emotion that seemed to come from somewhere beyond technique. When she finished, Adrian sat very still. "I hear it now," he whispered. "I've been playing this for years and I never heard that." "Because you were performing it," Mira said simply, "not living it." What neither of them noticed was Edward Sterling standing in the hallway outside, having returned early from a business trip. He'd been about to enter when he heard his son playing. But something was different. The precision was still there, but now there was something else. Something he hadn't heard since Lillian was alive. Through the gap in the door, Edward saw the maid's daughter standing beside the piano, eyes closed, swaying slightly. He saw his son glance at her between phrases, as if drawing courage or direction from her presence. Edward stood there for nearly 10 minutes, just listening. The next morning, he called Mr. Chen into his office. Mrs. Hayes and her daughter. I want their situation reviewed. Mr. Chen tensed, expecting the worst. Reduce Mrs. Hayes's heavy cleaning duties. Increase her salary by 20%. And make sure the girl has access to the music room during appropriate hours. Mr. Chen blinked. Sir, you heard me. Edward's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes had softened. Some investments don't show returns on a spreadsheet. Evelyn nearly fainted when she received the news. She kept asking if there was a mistake, if she'd done something wrong that they were trying to fix. It took 3 assurances before she believed it was real. Mira knew nothing of her grandfather's observation or his quiet intervention. She only knew that for the first time in her life, someone needed her voice not to mock it, not to be entertained by it, but to help them find something they'd lost. And Adrian was changing. In his practice sessions alone, he no longer played to impress invisible audiences. He played to understand. He'd pause mid-phrase and ask himself, what is this trying to say? Sometimes he'd get it wrong. Sometimes the music still came out mechanical. But increasingly, there were moments when his playing carried weight, carried meaning, carried the kind of truth his mother had tried to teach him years ago. The piano was no longer a trophy. It was becoming a language he was finally learning to speak. 3 weeks later, Harold Sterling made an unusual request. I want a private concert, he told Adrian one morning over breakfast. You on piano? That girl's singing. Just the 3 of us. Adrian glanced at his grandfather, surprised. You mean Mira? I mean the girl who reminded this family what music is supposed to sound like. That afternoon, the music room held only 3 people. Harold settled in the best chair near the window, Adrian at the piano, and Mira standing beside it, nervous in a way she hadn't been since that first night. Don't be afraid, child, Harold said kindly. I'm just an old man who misses beauty. Adrian played the opening bars. Mira closed her eyes and began to sing. This time was different from the chaotic evening weeks ago. There was no audience to shock, no mockery to overcome. There was only the music, honest and clear, filling the room, like light through clean windows. When the final note dissolved into silence, Harold sat quietly for a moment before speaking. Adrian, do you remember what you said that night? Sing this Mozart and I'll marry you. Adrian's face flushed red. Grandfather, I was being stupid. I didn't mean... Harold raised a hand, smiling. It was perhaps the most foolish thing I've ever heard you say. Mira looked down, uncomfortable, but Harold continued, his voice gentle but firm. And yet it was also accidentally true. Not the marriage part, you're both too young for such nonsense. But the principle behind it. He leaned forward slightly. If you ever decide to commit your life to someone, Adrian, choose someone who changes you when you listen to them. Someone who makes you want to be better than the person you were the day before. Someone who reminds you of the things you've forgotten about yourself. Adrian sat very still, his hands resting on the piano keys. This girl's voice made you remember your mother. It made you pick up music again, not as a party trick, but as something sacred. That's not a small thing. Harold turned to Mira. And you, child, you didn't just survive being mocked. You answered with grace. You taught without condescension. You gave someone back their heart without asking for anything in return. Mira's eyes welled up. No one had ever spoken to her like this, as if her existence mattered beyond the task she completed. Harold settled back in his chair. The joke wasn't that someone should marry her for singing. The truth is that you needed someone like her to save you from becoming completely lost. After Mira left, Adrian remained at the piano. His grandfather's words circled through his mind, uncomfortable and illuminating in equal measure. That evening, Adrian did something he'd abandoned 2 years ago. He pulled out the registration form for the regional youth piano competition. He'd quit after his mother died, telling his father that competitions were pointless, that he'd outgrown them. The truth was, he'd been afraid that without his mother in the audience, the music would mean nothing. Afraid that he'd gotten too far from who he used to be to ever find his way back. But now, filling out the form in his bedroom, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't entering to prove anything to his father or impress his friends. He was entering because he wanted to honor what Mira had helped him rediscover. There would be no friends in the audience this time, no social media posts, just him, the piano, And somewhere in his heart, the memory of his mother's voice mixed with the sound of a girl who'd learned Mozart in a basement and sang it like a prayer. He sealed the envelope and set it on his desk. Tomorrow he'd mail it. Tonight he'd practice not for perfection but for truth. This story began with a careless joke. Sing this Mozart and I'll marry you. But what mattered wasn't that arrogant promise. It was what happened after that voice rose into the air. A wealthy boy had to face an uncomfortable truth he'd taken for granted, the things that once meant everything to him. He'd turned music, his mother's final gift, into decoration, into entertainment, into something hollow. A 16-year-old girl, the maid's daughter, had no private practice room, no vocal coach, no prestigious music school on her resume. Just a heart that knew how to recognize beauty and the courage to let it out, even when the room was full of people waiting for her to fail. And yet that voice shook an entire household awake. This story reminds us that talent doesn't ask if you're rich or poor. It only asks one question: will you use me for something real? True music doesn't need a grand stage. It just needs one person willing to listen. Jokes at the expense of those with less power can become wounds that never heal. Or like that evening, they can become the unexpected beginning of something transformative. If you've ever been dismissed, ever been turned into someone's punchline simply because of where you came from, remember this: there may come a day when your voice, your gift, your heart makes those same people stop and reconsider everything they thought they knew. Not because you needed their validation, but because truth has a way of making itself heard, no matter how long it's been kept in basements and shadows. Now, I'm really curious, what city are you listening to this story from, and what time is it where you are? Write it in the comments. I'd love to know. Thank you for listening and sharing your precious time with me. For more real-life stories like this, check out the other videos on my channel. And don't forget to subscribe to Maid's Daughter Stories to follow more tales where small acts of courage light up a larger world.